everyone. I'm glad to introduce you to HUAWEI's Agile Campus Network Solution. This is the first session. Let's talk about the Wired and Wireless Convergence solution. Before we start, let's look at the wired and wireless deployment on a traditional network and see what limitations there are. The figure on the left shows the most traditional deployment mode, where an independent AC is used to control APs. Wired traffic and wireless traffic are separately forwarded. Wired traffic is directly forwarded to the switch, while wireless traffic is forwarded to the AC before the switch. Additionally, authentication points for wired and wireless services are separated. The authentication point for wired services resides on the switch, while the authentication point for wireless services resides on the AC. Later, we developed AC cards and have the network shown on the right figure. In this solution, customers can install AC cards on switches and no longer need to purchase independent ACs. But AC cards are essentially similar to independent ACs because wireless traffic still needs to pass through AC cards. The only difference is that this is internal loopback rather than external loopback. The wired and wireless authentication points are still separated from each other. In summary, traditional deployment solutions have three characteristics. One is separate forwarding of wired and wireless traffic. Second, wired and wireless services are separately managed. Third, policies are separately configured for wired and wireless services. All these limitations increase the deployment and maintenance costs. Now let's look at HUAWEI's Wired and Wireless Convergence solution. In this solution, switches provide the native AC function and act as ACs. They can identify CAPWAP packets and perform encapsulation and decapsulation on these packets. Wired and wireless traffic is forwarded by the same device. That is, cards on a switch can directly manage APs and no AC needs to be purchased. What's more, we integrate wired and wireless authentication on the line cards of a switch. So authentication and forwarding policies are unified for wired and wireless services. We credit all these benefits to the HUAWEI-developed ENP chips used on switches. These chips adopt a fully programmable architecture. After understanding the background, let's begin a practical training on how to manage and configure a wireless network. Here is a configuration example. Before the configuration, we need to sort out the entire network architecture and configuration roadmap. The network architecture is clear. From top to bottom, there are core, aggregation, and access layers. In this example, we use an S12704 at the core layer, an S5720EI at the aggregation layer, and two S5720SIs at the access layer. The S5720SI on the left supports the PoE function and is connected to an AP. The AP provides access for the downstream PC. The S5720SI on the right is connected to a PC in wired mode. Here we use wired MAC address authentication for the AP, wireless portal authentication for PC1, and wired 802.1x authentication for PC2. They are the three commonly used authentication modes. For the core S12704 switch, we assign three network segments. VLAN 10 is used for wireless management, VLAN 20 for wireless traffic forwarding, and VLAN 30 for wired traffic forwarding. In terms of the configuration roadmap, we configure devices from the bottom. First, configure the access and aggregation devices, including two S5720SIs and one S5720EI. We need to configure VLANs and transparent transmission of Layer 2 packets on these switches so that packets can reach the S12704 for authentication. Then we configure the core S12704 switch, which consists of 5 parts. First, configure gateway IP addresses and address pools so that the S12704 can assign IP addresses to APs and end users. Second, configure the Radius authentication server to authenticate end users. Here, we use HUAWEI's Agile controller as the Radius authentication server. Third, configure 802.1x authentication for wired PCs and MAC address authentication for APs. Fourth, Configure wireless portal authentication. Finally, configure WLAN services so that the S12704 can manage APs. On the Agile controller, we need to configure the S12704 as the authentication point, configure the AP to go online through MAC address authentication, and configure 802.1x and portal authentication users. Then, configure the authentication and authorization processes. Next, let's look at the detailed configuration process. First, configure the access and aggregation devices, including the configuration of VLANs and transparent transmission of Layer 2 packets. The configuration is simple, and we will not discuss it in detail. Then, we need to configure the core switch. First, configure gateway IP addresses, address pools, and the radius server. Let's perform the configuration step by step. This is the CLI of the S12704. Create VLANs 10, 20, and 30, configure IP address pools for these VLANs, and enable the DHCP function. VLAN 10. And 30. Server. Configure a shared key. Configure an authentication server with port 1812 and configure an accounting server with port 1813. Wired 802.1x and MAC address authentication. First, we need to enter the AAA view and create authentication and accounting schemes. Here, we use the default schemes and change the authentication mode to Radius. Enter the accounting scheme view, change the accounting mode to Radius, and configure the switch to keep users online in the event of accounting failures. Then, create an authentication domain and bind the Radius server, authentication scheme, and accounting scheme. Next, let's configure 802.1x and MAC address authentication. First of all, create a wired authentication profile and bind 802.1x and MAC address authentication profiles. Because no extra policy is required, we can use the default profiles and configure an access domain named HUAWEI. roadmap is as follows. Add the authentication point device and configure MAC address users of the AP. Choose Resources, Device Management from the main menu and add the S12704 as the authentication device. Enter the name, IP address, and shared key. Portal authentication and configure an authentication key. Here, we must configure the IP address list of wireless users so that they can pass portal authentication and go online. Let's configure 802.1x and portal authentication users and related authentication and authorization processes. On the User Management page, add a user group and create a portal and 802.1x authentication account. Here, disable this function. Otherwise, we need to change the password upon the next login. Now we need to perform the authentication and authorization configuration. Configure MAC address authentication for the AP. Select the AP group as the terminal group and select the created authorization result. We have finished all the configurations and service demonstration. It's been a great pleasure to share HUAWEI's Wired and Wireless Convergence solution with you. See you next time.